This morning we're going to talk a little bit about how to learn how to listen. And usually we listen to learn. So we're sort of shifting it up a little bit. We've got some really amazing panelists who can talk to us a little bit about hopefully what happened when they learned how to listen, what changed, and how that actually affected their work and the outcomes that they were looking to achieve. And I'm going to just start by introducing our panelists. Many of you probably know them. Jean-Marc Chouinard has been president of the Fondation Lucie, André, Chagnon. And we do have simultaneous translation because the panel will be bilingue, but I'll be mainly focusing on the English because it's just upsetting to hear me speak French. So Jean-Marc has been the president since 2016, and he's been with the foundation since its beginning, very shortly after it commenced in 2001. He's involved in numerous causes at the service of Quebec and received the Frederick Todd Award in the Association des Architects, thank you, Paysagistes de Quebec. He's actually a city planner by trade. So Jean-Marc will be talking a little bit about their journey around actually trying to prevent poverty and how listening to their stakeholders helped them to achieve that. To his right is Jane Rabinowicz, who's going to be talking about the silver dollar and her other work in food sovereignty, which is extensive. She's currently serves as the executive director of the USC Canada, one of the largest, longest standing and progressive international collaboration organizations, co-founder and vice president of Silver Dollar Foundation. When the Silver Dollar Foundation works to create resilience on a community level in Montreal. After serving as executive director of Centre Paul Roulant, a wonderful organization many of us know of. She Youth Run Meals on Wheels program. Jane worked as the director of development for Équiterre, Quebec's leading sustainable development organization. Jane was named one of the 53 most influential people in Canada's food system by the Globe and Mail. So welcome, Jane. And Collette. Collette.
That sounds ominous.
So a little extra applause for Collette. She actually arrived at about 1 a.m. last night to be here tonight. So thank you, Collette, for coming this way. And Collette has done this amazing branding exercise with the Atkinson Foundation. She's the executive director of the Atkinson Foundation, where I just hear Collette and I think, decent work, decent work. So Collette is at the Atkinson Foundation, a 75-year-old institution that focuses on strengthening movements for decent work, shared prosperity, and democratic renewal. These efforts were inspired by the example of Joseph Atkinson, who knew poverty before he knew wealth, and is a publisher of Canada's largest daily newspaper, the Toronto Star. She's also known for her organizational capacity and as a capacity builder with United Way Toronto and a champion for inclusive local economies when she was at the Metcalfe Foundation. So welcome. And Gabe Lindo. Gabe, I know in a couple of different worlds. He's a member of the board of directors, I think vice president of the Laidlaw Foundation, and he'll be talking today about Laidlaw's work in engaging youth in creating the world that they want to see. And I also know him from his work as the executive director of the Real World Festival, which is an amazing festival, which I think just was last week. And it's really leaning in and engaging with social change documentary and how we can affect social change by engaging with attitudes in media. And if any of you have sat with me for more than an hour, you know that that's an area of passion for me. So it's lovely to see you here, Gabe, to talk to us about Laidlaw and about Real World. So now I'm not doing a very good job of listening, so I'm going to take a seat and start the... So, why do we need to learn how to listen? What is actually broken that we are trying to fix? What is it that isn't working that we need to improve on? And we heard a little bit in the panel yesterday that there's some sense of just general frustration, that maybe the money's not going to the right place, that maybe it's not having the desired effect. But Marc, why don't I start with you? At what point did your team and your foundation start to think, we have a challenge here?
Eh bien, en fait, l'écoute a pratiquement changé beaucoup de choses pour nous dans l'organisation de la Fondation. Évidemment, je pense que le point crucial a été probablement autour des années 2009-2010. Et d'une certaine manière, une conséquence aussi des partenariats que nous avions avec le gouvernement, conséquence peut-être inattendue, qui a soulevé passablement de critiques à ce moment-là. Et déjà, en 2009-2010, on avait commencé à commander différentes études auprès de chercheurs de différentes organisations. Mais le cumul de ces informations qui venaient autant du terrain, autant des partenaires, autant de la recherche, nous a évidemment stimulé à dire, OK, ici, il y a vraiment un enjeu, il faut qu'on aille devant ces enjeux-là et écouter. Donc, ça a été, pas sous une forme d'obligation, je pense que ça a été simplement un constat que si nous voulions rester pertinents et nous ajuster dans ce que nous souhaitions faire, bien, nous devions écouter. Puis le deuxième grand constat, c'est que dans des projets comme les nôtres, par exemple le nôtre qui est de prévenir la pauvreté, bien entendu, ce sont des projets qui sont portés collectivement. Ce ne sont pas des projets qui sont portés seulement par une fondation. Et si nous voulons être un des maillons de la chaîne qui fait en sorte que nous participons à ce travail collectif, bien, nous devons prendre conscience que nous sommes en interdépendance avec plusieurs autres parties prenantes dans l'environnement, dans notre cas au Québec. Alors, à partir de ce moment-là, on s'est mis vraiment profondément à l'écoute. Évidemment, aujourd'hui, je pense qu'on peut, je ne rentrerai pas tout de suite dans ces détails-là, mais je pense qu'on peut dire aujourd'hui que les orientations que nous prenons sont synchronisées, en fait, avec ce qu'on a pu entendre et ce qui nous permet aujourd'hui de pouvoir nous inscrire dans un projet collectif qui n'est pas seulement le projet de la Fondation.
Merci, thank you. I'm hoping that we can almost have a little bit of a discussion. And so it's, I'm opening it up to you guys in terms of, does anyone have anything to sort of build on in terms of that, in terms of what was the real challenge? What were you trying to fix?
Should I can? Yeah. Sure. Okay, I can jump in. First, I'll just kind of acknowledge what Jean-Marc has said, being in Montreal and in Quebec during that time and living through it and seeing the foundation go through those challenges. I think that it's really remarkable and commendable the way that you guys have conducted yourself and turned it into a strength moving forward. So it's been an interesting process to kind of observe and from the outside. I might want to pick up actually on some framing from last night. From last night's panel from Caro, where she talked about, when we're thinking about social change, 3 categories of kind of players, and she talked about agitators, so people who draw attention to an urgent issue. She talked about innovators, so folks who are experimenting with different approaches to address those issues on the ground. And then she talked about the orchestration of an effort to make things better at the systemic level. And I think that from a point of view of listening, if I look at this list, civil society, community leaders are very present as agitators. They're very present as innovators. But in terms of the orchestration or orchestrators, access to influence and decision-making and power, and where those decisions are made that have system-wide impact, I think that's where you'll find a significant drop-off in the participation and presence of voices from community. And so I think there's huge potential to move forward. Like yesterday during the panel, the whole notion of the power relationship between grant maker and grantee is brought to the table, and I think that beginning with a process of deep listening is very important. And looking at that from a point of view, well, how does that change the way that I understand things before moving on to changing your actions? Like, I think that's very important. But I don't think it's enough. And I think that we need to really take a look at how to diversify the voices of around the table when we're talking about that level of orchestration and decision making at the systems level.
Thank you. And I mean, I think there's also an argument to say that if the innovators aren't listening to the agitators, then they don't actually know what to innovate. And if the organizers aren't listening to the innovators, then they don't know what to organize. I mean, there's actually a sort of a mutually dependent relationship in order to be able to do the work well, in order to be able to do it in an informed way. You think, does that
resonate?
Does that resonate? Movement builder?
Yeah, I mean, I think first, commend PFC to be holding this kind of a conversation at this moment in time. I mean, we are facing rising inequality, disruptive technology, and much more polarizing politics. And I think a lot of the folks that we work with, they're recognized as stakeholders who have interests in our processes, in policy processes, but not their democratic power. And I think we, like others who care about our communities, have to begin to think differently about how we engage folks then. Not simply as somebody we take information in from and then, do with it what we want. It's about really how is this work about reciprocity. And I think, as grant makers, how you come into this conversation, I think, is how is grounded in your history and your mission. As you have said, we see ourselves as part of movement building for decent work. So we locate ourselves inside the work, not on the edges of the work, not outside. And as part of that, listening is a piece of the work we have to do, but reciprocity, doing something with what we're listening for, is really critical. Let me take it right down to the ground, just for those who like the sort of crunchy details of grant makers. So a few things we did over the last few years just to change up how we were coming at our work. We, like many foundations, had not had an open process to solicit grants. And we decided 4 years ago that we were going to open up our grant making process, a part of it, and to ask a question. So we asked, what does decent work mean to you? And it really began, we were invitational, we were not prescriptive or propositional in that work. And it allowed us to listen to the sector across the province in a very different way and in real time, and to be able to respond. When we decided to get onto social media for the first time in a really substantial way, we spent several months listening. We listened in on the sites, on the Twitter feeds of folks that we either saw as allies in this work and/or were currently grantees or partners in the work, before we actually jumped in to figure out, okay, how are we going to contribute to this? In the work around our learning and evaluation, we went to folks and we first said, okay, what are you guys paying attention to? What matters to you? And then we talked about the things that matter to us and say, does this correlate? Is this part of your lived experience? And we created an evaluation and learning framework that was about show, tell, and then report. And by show, we have a closed Facebook group where people are just posting in real time. So we all have sight lines to each other's work and can invite each other. And I mean, this is across the folks that we work with. To show up for things that they want us to show up for, and vice versa, and across the group.
And there's a couple threads I want to pick up on there, but the first one is, when you were doing all of this listening, And it sounds like you've really iterated the way in which you listen, which is sort of learning how to listen is one piece. But what did you learn? What surprised you? Were there moments when you went, oh, thank goodness we're listening. We need to change to this way or that way? Or was it more of a confirmation?
No, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenge for all of us, or certainly I should speak for myself, is not listening to confirm your own bias, right? So, oh, let me listen to somebody so I can go, yes, this is what I thought all along. So it's about, part of that work was about getting out of your own comfort zone. And then if you're really building a trusting relationship, you know with your partners, and I'll give you a very concrete example from this year, that sometimes you listen and take the advice, sometimes you listen and you ditch the advice, and vice versa. And so this year we have an anniversary coming up in a few weeks. We turned 75. I think we're looking pretty good. And we had this great idea last October. We put it out to a lot of our partners, and this is a very pivotal moment in the fight for decent work in Ontario right now. We've got legislation on the table. We have this great idea. And we pitched it. We want to be part of this large global exhibit with art, and we could bring it in, our issues around fair wages, voice, power. We'd get a new audience. They all looked at us, and they were like, this is the most pivotal time in the fight coming into 2017. Why possibly would you spend your time that way? Not good. Not good. So we're like, oh, okay. And so we set it aside, and we've got a different set of things. And vice versa, they all wanted us to do something at Queen's Park last October. And right up until then, we're like, yeah, okay, we'll do it. We'll host this big thing at Queen's Park. And then we're like, that doesn't make any sense for us to do that. The way we were able to build on each other is that we went back and said, you know what, we thought a lot about it. This is why it makes no sense. It's not a good use of our time. It's not a good use of our position, because we have position power in a different way than them. Let's do something else. And so we did something else with them.
So thank you. And I mean, I think this points up a really important thing about listening is, what do you do after you've heard something? So one of the frameworks that we looked at in terms of when working with young people was that first you need to design your programs, your processes to be able to hear people. You have to design them to invite people to speak, to listen to. And you have to actually listen and try and address your own bias, not listen for what you're just already brought for confirmation. But then there's another piece which is about accountability. What are you going to do? What room do you have to do to actually change anything? And that's one of the things that many of us are challenged with. We work in this regulated environment, we have our missions, we have our boards. So now that I know that we should really be doing X instead of Y, what are we going to do about it? Or, well, actually we can't do Y because X, Y, Z. How do you reflect that back? How do you maintain accountability? And we found at Inspirit that this piece is really crucial to young people, because they're not too young people, but our stakeholders want to know why they should bother talking to us. Are we going to be accountable to what we're hearing? And Laidlaw works, with a very similar stakeholder group as Inspirit in many cases. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's is my mic on? Can you hear me?
I can't, no.
Do I have to do something?
Go. You can speak.
Yeah, okay. I was just going to say, I think that's a really important point. If I could take a small step back and say that, especially when you're dealing with young people, it's not just listening, but it's what's the environment in that you're engaging them. Is it a comfortable space? We all understand the sort of the power dynamics of in the positioning between potential youth and larger institutions. And so what are you doing to make the space that they're coming to speak to you comfortable for them, and make it an environment in which they're going to not just want to share and tell you what they think you want to hear, but actually be comfortable to tell you what perhaps you don't want to hear, and for them to know that they have that opportunity to do so. And it's not a small thing. And so I think the starting place, really, when we're talking about conversations with youth, it's that we have to do everything in our power to make it on their terms, or to make it so that they feel comfortable to speak to us. And you made a great point about, is it worth their while? What are you going to do with that information? What are you going to do out of that conversation? I think that perhaps there's a fatigue, because I think youth are often asked and polled, and they've often been, asked their opinions about things that perhaps go nowhere. They feel like they go nowhere. And so there is a responsibility, if you're going to engage with youth, that you have to take meaningful action to act on what you've heard and what you've been presented. Just in the context of Laidlaw, I think that something that we've tried to do very intentionally is to create safe spaces for those conversations, so we can get as authentic an opinion or a view from young people as possible. But also, it's not the construct isn't, we're this, large foundation that's smart and we know everything, but it's rather, we want to make it so that we can hear from you, and you can be a part of this conversation and a part of the decision making around the granting. And so we think very intentionally about incorporating those views, but also incorporating those youth onto advisories that are actually a part of decision-making processes around funding.
Right. So that's interesting, because really it links back to the power. And I realized that when you were speaking that I had an unconscious bias, that the grantees were the agitators. That sometimes they might be the innovators, the larger ones, but that then it was other people who were doing the systems change. And really, that therein lies a problem, right? So, this needs to shift. Who should actually be making the decisions in terms of the overall systems change? Who's involved in those rooms? And how do we actually facilitate that engagement, which is what I'm hearing you saying that you're starting to do. How do we talk about who's in the room and who's not in the room? I see some nodding heads over here. Would you guys like to build on that? Because what happens when you do that? What do you start to see once you're able to
Je pense qu'on touche un élément important dans toute cette discussion-là, qui est toute la question de l'enjeu structurel d'asymétrie des pouvoirs dans la relation qui est établie entre un bailleur de fonds et des partenaires. Et je pense qu'il faut d'abord commencer par reconnaître ça. Je pense que ce que Gabe dit est intéressant sur la question comment on crée des espaces sécurs pour avoir ces conversations-là. Mais aussi se dire que probablement ça restera toujours d'une certaine manière imparfait. Ça demeure une aspiration à laquelle on cherche à atteindre, mais il faut être très, très conscient constamment de cette asymétrie. Et puis, la question centrale, je pense, qui est abordée d'une certaine manière, là, c'est on pourrait beaucoup se centrer sur des éléments tactiques, parce que je pense qu'on peut écouter de bien des manières, on peut favoriser beaucoup d'éléments sur comment on design des programmes, comment on design des choses, comment on inclut les gens dans ces conversations-là. Mais à la fin de la route, dans les apprentissages que nous avons faits aussi dans notre cheminement, l'intention ou notre mission n'est pas suffisante pour être considérée comme légitime. C'est pas suffisant. Tout le monde est d'accord avec la prévention de la pauvreté. La question où les gens commencent à se poser des questions sur la légitimité, c'est qu'est-ce qui permet à certaines personnes de prendre des décisions? Et là, oui, il y a plusieurs processus qu'on peut mettre en place pour voir comment on travaille ça, mais je pense qu'on doit aussi s'intéresser aux questions, et je pense que certaines des personnes ici autour du panel sont impliquées là-dedans aussi. Quels sont les espaces de décision stratégique? Je pense que Jane a abordé cette question-là tout à l'heure. Quels sont les espaces de décision stratégique, pour ne pas le nommer les conseils d'administration? Dans notre cas, on s'est aussi donné, par exemple, ce qu'on a appelé un groupe d'éclaireurs, un scouting group, 10-12 personnes qui viennent nous challenger sur une série de choses. Donc, comment on constitue ces espaces aussi au centre de la décision stratégique? Comment on rend ces espaces-là plus nombreux et plus diversifiés au centre des décisions stratégiques, pas juste dans la partie tactique qui est importante néanmoins. Il faut arriver à systématiser l'information qui nous permet de prendre éventuellement des orientations. Alors la question après ça, c'est qui en font partie, quelle est l'ouverture et l'openness, vraiment l'ouverture, si ce sont des conseils encore familiaux, d'accueillir des gens de l'externe. Quelle est l'ouverture des discussions autour de ces tables-là? Je reviens à ce que Gabe disait, de vraiment créer des safe places autour de ces discussions-là. Et évidemment, qu'est-ce que l'on fait avec ça? Dans notre cas, je vous dirais que, par exemple, le conseil d'administration la composition du conseil d'administration a pratiquement suivi l'évolution de cela. C'est-à-dire, au début, c'était un conseil d'administration, dès le début, qui était majoritairement de membres externes à la famille, mais des membres externes qui étaient quand même relativement proches. Et au fur et à mesure où on avance, aujourd'hui, on est rendu avec des membres au conseil d'administration qui sont des gens qui viennent du terrain et qui viennent soulever des grosses questions, sinon faire des suggestions qui peuvent être disruptives, mais où l'espace permet cette écoute-là. Et si ce n'est pas possible à ce niveau-là, ça commence par le top. Hein? Et puis, je pense que le ton peut être donné après ça ou non sur notre capacité d'écoute comme organisation.
I can see.
Yeah. Yeah, I would add a few things to that. I agree with everything Jean-Marc just said. I think, to look at it from it's possible. It will always be imperfect in terms of the dynamic, but I think that it is possible to make significant shifts. And I think we should look at civil society partners, the community organizations that we fund, et cetera, who have profound expertise in bringing diverse people around the table to have difficult conversations and to move forward. I mean, this is one of the core competencies of being a community organizer, running a community organization, et cetera. And so there's a massive skill set that's available, I think, to provide support, because I think that there are analogies that can be drawn between the kind of engagement efforts and participatory planning processes and stuff like that that Jean-Marc is talking about, and the work that nonprofit organizations do all day, every day, in an inclusive manner, in a nonviolent manner, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think sometimes community leaders are turned to for their leadership in the services that they provide and the organizations that they run, but the profound expertise around approaches and systems, I think, is not necessarily tapped into enough. And I think that there's a good source of potential there. I also think intermediary organizations are interesting to look to, because organizations that both receive and grant funds. Examples being USC Canada, the organization I run, Tides Canada, where I sit on the board, Centraide, I sit on the board for many years. And I think that two-way accountability is very important. And I think that there are some examples that are already in place of organizations that have systems and processes established to do that. The final thing I'll just say on this point is that, some of that's tinkering with what's already there to improve it and to address and adjust the power balance a little bit. But I do think at a fundamental level, we need to talk about building up the asset base of the community sector. So from a social capital point of view, from a financial point of view, but also from a physical point of view. And that's why Silver Dollar Foundation focuses on granting specifically to purchase buildings. So that asset, we make the donation, but the asset stays in the hands of the community organization. That's one example, but I think we need to look at the building up long-term asset bases for community groups to have self-determination as well.
So it's really, in many ways, a pretty fundamental shift from what was traditional philanthropy, which was, let's solve this problem and we'll give some money to these people who are working to solve the problem. This is actually, it's actually sort of turning that on its head. Let's work ourselves out of a job by having our grantees be the people who are solving the problem. Is that, and so that they have the resources, capacities, and actually, you know what, they kind of know a lot of this stuff better than we do. I mean, I know that in terms of engaging with difficult conversations, that, you know, we don't get taught that in business school, right? We get taught how to say all the nice stuff. We don't get taught how to actually have those authentic conversations.
So, I mean, I guess again, I go back to, you know, your mission, what you're trying to do. You're trying to solve a simple, a complicated, or complex issue. A simple one, it really can be transactional. You might actually know what the fix is. And so in that way, it's much more of an exchange. If you're trying to work on complexity, issues around how we address climate change, issues of growing income and wealth inequality, those are issues where both the drivers and the solutions are highly contested. And so how you come into those spaces, how you work with folks, depend who you listen to. Who do you listen to more? Whose advice do you value? What do you do with it? It's going to depend, I think. And, you know, some of this stuff goes back to, I think, your values of your organization. You know, what are the values? You know, we all write these nice mission statements and values. You know, how much do we go back and actually say, how am I living into this? This year we started a process. So we've been building our learning and evaluation framework over the last 3 years. And this year we made a commitment to twice a year come together as a team, first to look at our approach. So values, how we live, how we behaving into our values. And then next month we'll look at it against the impact. So part of this work, this listening, is about better reflective practice. And I was like, oh my God, we've got so much to do. Whose dumb idea was it that we're going to spend a day in taking to the areas we work in? So working on the fight for minimum wage, fighting for minimum wage and labor and employment reform, and then fighting for around community benefits and equitable economic development. We're going to use these, and we're going to go through a guided process. We're going to look at them. Did we put equity at the center? Did we put those whose voices are most affected? Did we listen to them with both uncommon patience and take our cues from them, et cetera? We went through our things. And it was really good because we got to see where we did well and where our growing edges were. I think so part of what I think has helped us a lot in our work, and again, I think it's what are you trying to change? What are the tools you're drawing on? We now work in 3-month cycles. Every 3 months, we're adapting our work. It doesn't mean we don't have a North Star where we're trying to go and don't have some sense of the year, but because the kind of change we're trying to work on is in a policy context, it's dynamic, stuff happens in the world, things pop up. Every 3 months, we have to be listening. We have to be listening to what our partners tell us, because sometimes we're going to have to go, that was a great idea, but it is now irrelevant. And so I go back to culture. What are you trying to change? What's the kind of problem or opportunity you're trying to come at? And then how you listen, who you listen to, and what you do with it, I think is fluid. It's going to change.
So I'm going to ask, I think a lot of this, thank you, and I think that a lot of this listening, learning to listen, is actually about establishing a certain level of relationship and trust. I see some heads nodding. You have to create the safe spaces for the young people. There's a process through being able to be nimble enough to be able to be responsive. There's a sort of broader picture in terms of your theory of change around how change happens. But what does this mean? I mean, you know, it's a wise person, one of you, I think, said that once you know one foundation, you know one foundation. So we all have very diverse areas of working, diverse ways of working. I'm going to pull up the next slide, and I don't know where the clicker is, so I'm going to ask the gentleman with the headphones on to just click to the next slide for me. Because for me, I like to actually have a little bit of a framework around how do we do this. So we kind of know what we're talking about in a theoretical framework. And a shout out to my colleague Chris Lee, who did a bit of research for me in terms of what are some actual resources and places that organizations that are talking about this. And he led us to the Whitman Institute. And the Whitman Institute is doing trust-based approach to philanthropy. It's informed by a decade of experience that relationships are stronger and more effective when they are built on a foundation of trust. Go figure. Our approach relies on the following. They actually have 9 key pillars. And you can see it's a little bit of a process that they go through. They provide unrestricted multi-year funding. They do their homework. They partner in spirit and service. They offer open and responsive communication. They solicit and act on feedback. They encourage transparency, simplify and streamline paperwork. So this is what this actually starts to mean in practice. They support beyond the check, and they host restorative retreats. So we all have the intention to listen and to learn and to improve what we do, and that's what we do every day. We want to do it as well as we can. But some actual tactics that we can start to look at in terms of what are our operations like. So these are these four things. Provide unrestricted multi-year funding. I mean, you know, we heard this yesterday. How do you support organizations to become sustainable and grow so that they can actually do their work in a way that is effective? What do we take upon ourselves to learn before we go into the conversation? I was at a round table on reconciliation. You know, what homework do we need to do before we walk into the room and start to engage? Open and mutual partnership. What does this theory of change about whose job is whose start to look like? How does that iterate? And continuous connecting and convening. And I think that creating these safe spaces, having these conversations for feedback, this is fantastic examples. So I guess one of the things I'd like to know from the four of you, and Gabe, maybe I'll start with you, engaging in these changes, both from a values perspective, from a mission perspective, and from a tactical operations perspective, were there any unintended consequences? Were there things that you planned to achieve with these shifts or did not plan to achieve with these shifts? Positive or negative?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'll say to that, I think that I was thinking about this idea of listening, and implicit in that is that there's a divide of sorts. We're listening to people that we're granting to, and so this conversation in part is about being open to listening to others. But I think that for me, we may have to look at why are we not integrating the people we're supposed to be listening to into our organization, into our actual operations, so that it's not about just listening to those who we're granting to, but those who we're granting to are a part of our organization or a part of our community or a part of our process. So I think that's very important. And to be honest, I don't know that we can actually accomplish the goals of serving a particular community if that community is not embedded into the decision-making process in a real and tangible way. So it's something for us to think about from that perspective. To answer your question more specifically, I think that one of the things that Laidlaw has done is we've recognized that there are various ways in which we can engage youth in various projects and scales of projects. However, in terms of we have a stream which is really it's up to $1,000 that we can give to an unincorporated group of young people who want to do something. And they have to obviously present, a pitch of what they'd like to accomplish, and it's a very short-term engagement typically. But one of the things that we've noticed is that, the outcomes or the specified outcomes of what they've described the project to be is, in fact, less important than the fact that they're actually doing something. And it's been, I think, an openness to appreciating that there is actually value in the action of doing something collectively, as opposed to what that specific outcome is that they've planned or they thought that they were going to achieve. And so, if we're so caught up in sort of the short-term metrics of, did you accomplish your specified objectives, instead of looking at, well, what was the actual impact to the group of people who were engaged in that process? How did that change their confidence? How did that build their leadership potential? How did that open their mind or connect them to others that they wouldn't have met otherwise? Those are the things that perhaps weren't the specified objective of some of these projects, but were the outcomes. So I think being able to separate outcomes from the perspective of specified goals, and looking also at the unintended benefits of just working together collectively as young people.
So what do you think, thank you, do you think that's an acknowledgement of intentionally supporting relationship building? I mean, that's sort of what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think it's also about trust, right?
Yeah.
It's also giving people, cutting the paperwork essentially, so that it's a very easy process. We're going to trust you to do something. You have an idea, you want to work with a group of others. We're going to trust you to do it. And even if the result isn't exactly what you've said or intended to accomplish, we appreciate that there's value in the action itself of coming together and deciding to do something.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I see some nodding. Have you guys also found, in agreement with that, but are there other unintended consequences, positive or negative, that you've sort of stumbled upon? Yeah.
You want to
Go, Jean.
Okay. Oh, wait.
Go ahead.
Okay. We're such a polite panel. So again, so one of the things I would say I have been, how do I want to start this? So I've been working in this area for a long time, and my experience over 20 years is littered with, oops, should have listened more. Whoops, unintended consequences, i.e. you think you're doing something good in a community and you actually stir things up because you weren't on the ground and you didn't have the right sight lines, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of but in recent years, because we have been trying to work to build a stronger movement to address income and wealth inequality, by nature it means that we're working with people who have a base. Okay, so that means often we're working with membership-based organizations, workers' rights organizations. We work with labor. We work with municipalities. We work with lots of different folks, but people who have constituencies. So first thing is we do a really good job of listening to the people who listen. Mm-hmm. And you can talk about that as an intermediary. I know you brought that thread up. Mm-hmm. But the thing that coming into that with a clarity that, that's who we want to try and work with. And we're coming into it from an invitational stance. I mean, you opened with, we're about decent work. You hear that a lot now. We didn't go out to people and say, you all have to be decent work advocates. But it was it was a concept that people could grasp and make meaning for themselves. All of us have a story about work in our lives. People were able to come into it and say, we want, so that 4 years later, sometimes we're at the front of the parade, sometimes we're in the middle of the parade, sometimes we're at the back of the parade, sometimes we're not even in the parade. It has been extraordinary how much people are showing up and owning these things for themselves. Now, granted, we're working on an issue that's in the paper every day. We know in all of our communities that if you don't have access to a job where you can sustain yourself and your family, you don't have to do it you're not trying to piece together 3 or 4, it's harder. But for us, it's meant that we're the momentum of the work is carrying itself. And I don't know if I quite would have imagined that a few years ago. And I think part of that has been about how we showed up in the space in the first place. And part of it has been about, as we've moved through it, we have stopped and said, what do people need now? And sometimes that's meant in our case, and granted, I have a board who is okay with us going off book. So yes, we might have a grant cycle, but if somebody needs something now, we have processes where we can respond in real time to things, or we have money that we can use in service that if somebody says, oh my God, we need a study right now, okay, we can help them figure that out. But it's allowed the issue and the movement to move. Like, I think if we stepped back now, it'd keep going.
Yeah. Jane?
Yeah, maybe what's coming to me is just this idea of getting inside, onside before you go outside.
Yeah.
And actually from the grantee point of view, because I think what I've observed in different organizations is that the form of how we understand partnership often will vary from kind of stakeholder to stakeholder. So the way that we would view a partnership with a volunteer or someone who is a beneficiary of services we provide, or a member of the movement, and the how we consider their opinion, et cetera, can oftentimes be different from how we see partnership with a funder. And I think the whole question of is it a transformative relationship or is it a transactional relationship? There is onus on both sides to make a shift. And I think that too often within NGOs receiving funds, there's a very limited definition of partnership with funders, and it is more transactional. And I think that needs to change if we're going to benefit from the combined knowledge, skills, assets, everything that we all have. And I think I don't have solutions. I've seen those transformations happen, but I think that's something that needs to be that's something that needs to be addressed.
Great, thank you. Marc, would you like to add anything to that in terms of?
J'avais également cet élément-là là, sur la question de la relation transformative. Là.
Yeah.
Mais ce qui m'a sauté, la première idée qui m'est venue, ça a été plus un paradoxe aussi, parfois lié à nos efforts d'écoute. Je vais donner un exemple concret. Pendant plusieurs mois, voire plusieurs années, on a reçu le message d'éviter, par exemple, de soutenir dans le futur des services directs à la population, de peur, à juste titre, de remplacer le rôle que l'État jouait ici et joue encore au Québec. Alors, le jour où on dit que nous ne soutenons plus des services directs à la population et on souhaite se diriger davantage dans un soutien au développement de la capacité de ces organisations-là à pouvoir innover, à rechercher des conditions, à travailler sur les conditions qui génèrent des inéquités en réussite éducative, par exemple. Tout d'un coup, toute cette écoute, en fait, pendant des années où on s'est fait dire ça, devient un défi commun. Parce que pour les organisations qui recherchent encore de l'argent, bien sûr, pour mettre en place des services directs à la population, tout d'un coup, la Fondation ne devient plus une source de financement possible à leur demande. Mais un coup qu'on a dit ça, qu'est-ce qui arrive? Que devient après ça vraiment le défi commun à trouver des solutions quand même aux enjeux qu'ils vivent au quotidien? Alors des fois, il peut y avoir aussi des paradoxes. Quand on pousse l'écoute au maximum, on peut se retrouver aussi face à un moment donné à des enjeux. Et c'est peut-être juste une question de readiness. Là. Les gens ne sont pas prêts encore à passer à l'autre étape. Mais à leur demande, à l'écoute générale de plusieurs types de publics, on arrive à ces conclusions. Et on peut se retrouver aussi dans des situations paradoxales.
Yeah, yeah. So there has to be some real intention, right?
Yeah.
Real intention so that you don't actually create challenges that you're trying to solve. Problems and that can probably, from what I'm hearing from the rest of the panelists, that two-way conversation allows you to maybe sidestep some of those landmines and or know what to do when you've stepped on them, right? And so you can go deeper when you have trust with your grantees. You can go larger by slowing down and actually doing the work to create those relationships in the terms of a movement. And you can go, and you can be more nimble and be more effective. So I think, are there some questions? I know that this is a group of people that have been doing this for a long time. Do you think I should open it up to the people? Is it too early to chat? Does anyone have a comment or a question? I'm going to open it up there. Interrupt at any time. Throw your hand up. Or we'll just keep going because we're chatty. Okay. Well, please let me know. Somebody just throw your hand up, and we'd love to be able to open this broader than just the four of us. So I put Vuli's name up there and the nonprofit Always Fresh, which is formerly known as nonprofitwithballs.com. And this is a link to a blogger and thought leader in the US that, again, thank you to Chris Lee, who's put me in touch with. And I've started reading some of the blogs. So sometimes we don't, the power relationship has been alluded to. So I'm granting to you, you need to have my funds, and I'd like to really tell me the truth about what you feel about us or our work, or I'd like to listen to what the challenges are. I mean, how much do you think you're going to get? It's kind of like asking your teenager how was school, right? It's not that grantees are teenagers, but there's a power relationship that we've all acknowledged, and before that trust is built, how do you actually start having these conversations that have some real truth in them? And I would say that it's going to take a little while, but you can go and read Vuli's blog and actually find out, get some insight into at least how some of the nonprofits, and him in particular, are actually engaging. And it's a bit of a tough read, right? So that's the other thing that I'll just bring up. You don't always hear what you want, right? And how do you increase your capacity as an organization to actually be ready for some of those difficult conversations, to actually, because I think that that's a piece we don't get a lot of, no, you're wrong, could you do it differently, actually, in our general dialogues, right? Generally, it's thank you, we couldn't have done it without you, this is fantastic, we love you. And, those are fantastic conversations. How do you shift from those to the more challenging?
I guess for me, it comes down to monitoring and evaluation and learning, and I don't know the answer. It's a question. When foundations are looking at monitoring, evaluation, and learning, looking at measuring impact, is most of that happening in terms of the impact of the projects and programs and organizations that are being supported? How much effort is being put into monitoring, evaluation, and learning of the grant-making activities of the foundation itself? What are the indicators that we would choose to track? Do we want to play a role as a convener? Okay, is that something that we've done well? Do we want to address power dynamics in the grantor-grantee relationship? How do we track that, et cetera? So I think that you first have to give yourself the aspiration to take a look at some of these things, understand that that's an internal look to a certain degree, and then looking at relationships with partners, and then set yourself up to actually integrate that in a monitoring and evaluation framework, which doesn't have to be super heavy. Mm-hmm. And then best case scenario would be share the results and validate the results with the community.
Can you give me an example how that's worked for you in your organization?
Did you want to jump in?
Do you want me to jump in? Sure. Well, no, I was going to pivot it so I can give that an example if you want of doing that.
I mean, again, so for just quickly, yeah, like, well, I mean, it goes to a little bit the intermediary. Like, so for USC Canada, for example, when we are building programs, we build programs with the community members we work with. That is what ends up getting put forward for, like, it's very, very fundamental to the whole process. And then there is a loop back to the folks that we've worked with to build and deliver initiatives to talk about how we've done. So it's like monitoring, evaluation, and learning happening kind of in a cyclical way. It's obviously imperfect, but I would say that we aspire to look at both the activities that are happening on the ground and also how we're doing in terms of, playing our role as a convener.
So I was just going to say that, part of this, if you really want to do this, this is about, particularly in this room, I'm looking around and we're mostly all white, right? It's starting with examining our own privilege, and not in a bad way to like go, oh, what, like guilt-ridden, but like you have to do some work. We have to do our own work in order to be good partners and good listeners with the people we're working with, particularly if they are those who have historically been disenfranchised and historically don't have voice. Because we do walk in the room with money, we do have power, and in fact, if this room is a representative sample of who we are as a community, we are not diverse and we don't reflect the communities to a large extent that we're trying to support and to change. So a piece of that work is about owning that privilege and then doing the work you need to do before you go out and try and process it with community, right? I mean, I really do think that's our work. And part of that's about what we do internally in our own shops. How do we structure our processes to make it as easy as possible? Sometimes we write the proposals with our partners because we're better. I sit with a bunch of people who are really good on language, and they're better at doing the work, and dear God, I don't want to drain their capacity. Now, we're a small batch organization, which means we don't have massive volume of grants. We have big grants, a lot of big grants, and then we're doing a bunch of other stuff. But it means trying to then show up in the way that you're needed, and then using, as you're saying, your monitoring, your evaluation, to listen, and then to figure out, does it actually add capacity to the systems and things they're trying to change, or is it a drain? And like we kind of only really sort of listen, we get the report, and then we put it on their shelf, and then don't do it, don't ask that.
We have two questions, one here and then over here. And maybe you can either come up or else I'll repeat your question for the translation. If you'd like, yeah, that would be great. Just go to the podium. Sorry, I didn't tell the PFC team we were going to ask questions, open for questions. We're being iterative.
So a comment and then a question. At the heart of all of this is scarcity, isn't it? And it's kind of the big elephant in the room that we never talk about. Because there's only so much money. Like, in our secret dream life, there'd be a money machine in the basement, right? And we would print as much money for all the wonderful things that we would love to do. But that's not the way it is. So we do talk to those that we do fund. But it's a bit like the old thing that a cash register never picks up the sales that you didn't get at the store. It only measures what you did get at the store. Is there merit, do you ever think about talking to those you didn't fund? Sort of doing scans within the community that kind of says, crap, we missed a goodie. I mean, we could have really, they were in fact more effective than maybe what we did. So if I could put that to the panel.
What a great, I see some enthusiastic nods all around. Who would like to just validate that first? Yeah.
Ben, je dirais même que l'écoute pourrait commencer même auprès de la population qu'on cherche à desservir. Donc, par exemple, dans notre cas, il y a différents mécanismes actuellement de communication que nous avons avec près de 300 000 familles, par exemple. de manière régulière. La question, c'est comment pouvons-nous vraiment systématiser cette information pour comprendre quels sont les besoins, quelles sont les aspirations de ces gens-là. On soutient des études ethnographiques dans plusieurs quartiers, dans plusieurs régions du Québec pour mieux comprendre la même chose. Donc, je pense que ça commence même auprès des populations qu'on cherche à desservir. Et bien entendu, bon, il y a les gens de la recherche, il y a toutes sortes, mais bien entendu des groupes. Et c'est seulement en se mettant en relation régulière avec différentes parties prenantes qui ne sont pas nécessairement des gens que nous supportons, mais c'est seulement en étant en relation régulière avec l'ensemble des membres de cet écosystème-là qu'on peut avoir cette information-là.
Fantastic, fantastic. Anyone else want to add to that, or we have one more?
I would briefly, just quickly.
Yeah.
I've never done it. I think it's a fantastic idea.
Yeah.
And to the point of scarcity, one of the things I actually did want to raise is that there is huge competition in the NGO sector, and I think when we're talking, and the traditional way of working is really still proposal development, proposal submission, the follow-up, all of that stuff. So I think that in that way of working, we don't really think about the folks who didn't get funded, but the system is imperfect, and there are definitely some wonderful projects and great alignment that could have happened that didn't happen because it's an imperfect system, like hiring, right? It's imperfect, but I think it's an interesting question. Looking at the high level of competition that exists in the sector, that the traditional way of doing things in terms of proposal development, submission, et cetera, actually feeds that competition between NGOs. When we're talking increasingly about collective impact, how can we address this? Bringing people and looking at, the role that funders have in terms of having vast networks. We know of organizations that could have affinities, et cetera, et cetera. So can we be bringing people together to have conversations about collaborative efforts and start experimenting with ways to address some of the imperfections of the current way of doing things.
Thank you. Thank you. We have one more question. Thank you.
Hi there. Yep. So I want to thank you all for this panel and also thank PFC again for organizing it. I think it's been hugely energizing and it takes a lot of vulnerability to have this conversation up front. I've been really excited by the way that you keep coming back to the notion of sharing power and of not just listening, but bringing frontline community members into decision making. If we think about what it looks like to go all the way with that, it looks like having boards that are dominated by people from frontline communities who are making decisions and who are controlling the institution. Or it looks like, back to that role of intermediaries, assembling panels of frontline community members who make the granting decisions. So I'm thinking about, in Toronto, the Groundswell Fund that's controlled by frontline community members. Or in the US, there's many, many funds that assemble panels of community organizers to make their decisions. Why do you think we have so few examples of going all the way like that here in Canada? And what do you think are some of the barriers that we can be working on to get there?
It's a great question. Why are we not further ahead? Don't know if anyone else read today that George Soros has given away his, I think, $53 billion. So in the US, they're actually going beyond engagement, but redistributing the wealth. How are we doing in Canada? Why are we not further? We're nice people. We're nicer than them. So,
I don't know if we particularly. Go ahead, Nova.
maybe that niceness.
I think it depends on where you're located in philanthropy, right? I think community foundations do a heck of a lot of listening, and they're much of the way they're constituted as boards and grant panels are driven from the ground up because many of them are very tiny. I think in private philanthropy, often it's because it's an individual or a family who are, have set up and they're either living into a legacy today of a vision somebody set. I guess I'm just going back, context matters. And I think a piece of this also happens when we often think, because we have money, we're often, we know we're smarter, we have I think there's a piece of that goes on. And then the other piece is, sometimes you got to figure out what are the right ways to listen and what are the right ways to bring in voices, and it will depend. So on some boards that are maybe 3 or 4 people, that's not going to be the way that they're going to bring diversity into their space. It's the way they're constituted. So, but there are other vehicles they could use. They could use advisory committees. They could, we do these things. We do story slams every year. I mean, there's lots of different ways that you can bring folks in. And part of it is if you want to go right to the boards ultimately are the ones, at least in my organization, who make the decision on how money flows. They approve the budget annually and they approve our grants. Yeah. And so it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we have either both at our board or in the processes we're using to come to our board, that there are places where there are checkpoints and people can call us on it. But sometimes, I don't know, like our work, some of our foundations are really, really tiny. And it'd be really hard to think about how we do that. I think that's some of it. We're a young, relatively speaking, community too. And culturally, it's about private money for public good.
Yeah. So I think that, often you can break things down to intent or capacity, right? People want to have a more collaborative granting program, or it's, it's our family money and we want to save kittens with it and we don't care what you think, right? So there's that. And then we do want to have a more collaborative process, but we don't quite know how, or we don't have the staffing. This is what I'm hearing. I think there's something a little bit larger, actually, than that as well. And sort of I think that in terms of my lifetime, I grew up in Kitsilano in the 70s. A lot of co-op everything, right? It was really engaged. It was a time of a lot of engagement. Co-op housing, co-op schools, a lot of meetings. And then there was a huge shift to really a very much more conservative, market-driven kind of value system in this country, where we started to reduce government, we started to reduce process, we started to be completely obsessed with efficiency, right? So we have this idea that doing things well means doing them efficiently. And the truth is, this is not the fastest way to get the money out the door, right? So in trying to move towards an efficient process, have we actually gone too far, is what I'm hearing, that we actually start to have to slow down, to do things with a little bit more labor, not as quickly, or as, what are we measuring in terms of effectiveness, potentially?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, if you ask people how they like coffee, what's the best type of coffee, they'll tell you it's a dark, rich roast. But most people drink, creamy, sugary coffee, right? And so there's a disconnect when you're doing consumer research that you can't really just ask people what they want or what they think, because they may not know, or they may tell you what they think you want to hear. And so, just to build off of that, I think that the challenge with, the construct of how you're asking questions and how we're doing evaluations, it's so important and it's so integral to getting the data that's actually going to be valuable and useful. Just having and I know, most people in this room spend a lot of time thinking about evaluation and thinking about the types of questions that we're asking grantees. But I think also that we should spend more time thinking about failure and not making failure seem as something that's negative. Encouraging grantees to be honest about what didn't work so that we can learn from that. And in fact, rewarding them for their candor. Because I think ultimately, if we're learning about what is effective, what's not, anyone who's writing, I shouldn't say this as an ED of a nonprofit, but I think that everyone can write a final report in a way that makes it look glowing and successful, right? I would never do that, of course. But,
Good to know.
Liban over here, however, I don't know. No, just joking. No, but I think that the point I'm getting at is if, what are we listening to? What is the value of the data that we're listening to? And how are we, what is the quality of it? And I think part of how we can improve that data collection and the listening is ensuring that we're creating a process that enables us to have the best information possible. I think part of that is taking away the risk from grantees around providing us with information that we're not going to penalize them with. And of course, no one wants to tell, thanks for all this money, yeah, everything we did didn't work. But that is innovation. That is determining, that's invention. It's understanding what has not been effective in this particular context, in this particular situation, at this particular time. That's valuable. Not just the stuff that makes headlines or we send out in newsletters as updates. I think that we have to spend a lot more time listening to the things that appear not to be good but really are.
So assumptions and learning goals. I'm going to suggest that you all scan through the nonprofit AF Always Fresh. See if there's an article that sort of can give you a little bit more information about a subject that you've been curious about. Seek out more resources from grantee perspectives, from activist perspectives around your subject matter so that we are diversifying the voices that we are listening to. And on that, thank you for listening. And thank you to our panelists. It was fantastic for giving us up.